The capture of Gerald Chapman. Before Dillinger. Before Capone. There was Gerald Chapman. On January 18, 1925, Gerald Chapman, super bandit, mail robber, prison escapee, murder suspect, walked away from Dr. Harry Spickerman's door, about to spend his last few minutes of freedom on the streets of Muncie, Indiana. He shouldn't have been there. Spickerman, his contact and collaborator in Muncie, should have warned him not to come back. Why didn't he? Instead, the next day in Indianapolis, there was the captured Gerald Chapman, 700 miles and 25 years removed from an orphaned kid, in the streets of New York City. His name was George, not Gerald. George Chartres. What combination of circumstances brought the kid from New York City to his surprising end in Muncie, Indiana? George Chartres, aka Gerald Chapman, spent the first 20 years of his life in New York City. His mother died in 1892 before his 5th birthday, and with the death of his father in 1898, George, his brother, and sister went to live with relatives. In 1900, George and his brother were living with his aunt, Catherine Connors, and her husband, John. George's sister was living with cousins at that time. George's childhood was difficult in the tenements of New York, and very similar to that of many other criminals of the time. His first arrest for theft was in August of 1902, and he spent 1 year in the New York City House of Refuge, a reform school for boys under the age of 16. He finished high school and was briefly enrolled in Cathedral College, but became involved with a group of delinquents called the Park Avenue Gang, and distanced himself from his family. By late 1906, he was involved with a gang of jewel thieves breaking into homes and apartments in central Manhattan. The gang was broken up in February of 1907, and George was arrested, tried in March, and sent to prison in April 1907. He spent 14 months in Elmira Reformatory. As a result of his continued criminal behavior, he spent all but 6 months of the next 12 years in prison. In 1910, in Auburn Prison, George crossed paths with the enigmatic Arthur Cowboy Hill. Hill was a thorn in the side of police in Cleveland, Toledo, and several other places from 1903 until 1920. Who was Cowboy Hill? Where did he come from? No one really knows, primarily because what he told us about himself can't be proven. He stated he was a Native American from Montana, but there is no documentation of this claim beyond his own statements. He left us with more than 30 aliases to further confuse the issue. At the end of his life, he insisted his real name was Joseph Muzio. This, too, is impossible to prove. Both George and Arthur were released from Auburn Prison in late May of 1911. Arthur went back to Ohio and was in and out of prison for the next 7 years. George stayed in New York. Soon after his release, George Chartres began using the name Gerald Chapman, and on October 28, 1911, he was arrested again for raiding apartments. While handcuffed to the arresting officer, he stole his gun and tried to hold the officer hostage. The landlady of the apartment building assisted the policeman by choking Chapman and forced him to drop the gun. This time, Chapman was sentenced to 10 years in prison, primarily because of the assault charge related to the escape attempt. He spent 3 months in Sing Sing and over 4 years in Dannemora before being transferred back to Auburn on December 28, 1916. It was in Auburn this time where he met his partner in crime, Dutch Anderson, in April of 1917. Anderson was in Auburn in 1917 because in February 1913, he and 4 Ohio criminals robbed the Philip Presson jewelry store in Rochester, New York. 2 of the men involved in this robbery with Anderson, Joe Forrest and Leo Mitchell, would later join Chapman and Anderson in Ohio. Anderson's real name was Ivan Dahl von Teller, and he used this on a draft registration card filled out in September of 1918, declaring that he was a German citizen. He also listed his permanent residence as Toledo, Ohio. In March 1919, Chapman and Anderson left Auburn Prison, and within 4 months had joined a gang based in Toledo, Ohio, the Cowboy Hill Gang. So, the first stop in Chapman's progress toward Muncie was Toledo, Ohio. The Cowboy Hill Gang was an amorphous group of as many as 50 associate members, with a stable core of 9 men: Gerald Chapman, Dutch Anderson, Arthur Cowboy Hill, Archie Dennison, Joe Forrest, George Red McGann, George Jiggs Losdiner, Albert Edward Johnson, Eddie Meehan. In court in 1922, Chapman admitted to being a bootlegger in the Detroit and Toledo region during the years 1919 and 1920. Bootlegging was just part of what he and Anderson were doing. They helped extend the scope and range of the Cowboy Hill Gang by planning and researching potential robberies while they traveled throughout the Midwest. It is within this context that they probably met Dr. Spickerman in Muncie. Chapman and Anderson spent a lot of time on the road looking for crimes to commit, and there were several possible attractions in Delaware County, Indiana. It is probable they were encouraged to visit Muncie by fellow gang member Eddie Kelly. Kelly had been in Muncie in 1905 as a member of a gang that robbed the Ridgeville Bank that year. Eddie would have told Chapman and Anderson about the saloons he visited in Muncie, saloons located in the red light district on South Walnut Street. He might have told them about a possible contact by the name of Arnold Burden. When they got to Muncie, they may have found Arnold Burden and discovered that he was employed by a banker, and that he had a friend by the name of Dr. Harry Spickerman. When they talked to Harry Spickerman and sold him some Canadian whiskey, they may have discussed the possibility of supplying morphine to him. The Cowboy Hill Gang specialized in daylight robberies of banks. They worked in teams that varied in size, but were usually 4 or 5 men. Their first bank robbery was in Ohio, but the second was in New York, at about the time Dutch Anderson was released from the county jail. Anderson was released from Auburn in March of 1919, but was immediately faced with incarceration due to crimes committed prior to 1913 in Buffalo. He was given a sentence of 4 months in Rochester, New York. His release coincides with the first of 3 bank robberies committed by the Cowboy Hill Gang in the East. The circumstantial evidence linking these 2 robberies to Chapman and Anderson is only believable because of more extensive documentation of the 3rd robbery, which occurred on November 17th near Boston. Chapman was specifically identified as being a member of the group involved. January 13, 1920. The 1920 census proves helpful in establishing Chapman's link to Toledo. This includes a record of Betty Bates, Chapman's girlfriend, and possibly his wife. At the time, she was living in a rooming house with her brother and sister and working as a telephone operator. Betty was from Indiana. She was born in Lafayette, and her childhood was spent in Colfax. She also lived for a time in Indianapolis. January 9, 1920, the 1920 census in Toledo also includes 2 men that might have been Anderson and Chapman using assumed names. The 2 men sharing an apartment call themselves Charles Colwell and Clarence Lafarge. Chapman and Anderson would use these surnames a year later when they moved back to New York City. January 19, 1920, John Brennan, later to travel to Muncie with Chapman and Anderson, was also living in Toledo in 1920 and shows up in this census. The gang fell apart as a unified entity at the end of 1920. In Toledo during the summer of 1920, Archie Dennison and Cowboy Hill had a primary residence at 2220 Franklin Avenue, about a half mile from where Betty Bates lived. September 14, 1920, operating on a tip, a group of about 20 Toledo policemen, armed with shotguns and revolvers, raided the hideout the morning of the 14th with the intent to arrest Archie Dennison. Joe Forrest answered the door and gave up without resistance, but Archie pulled out his automatic and was killed in the ensuing gunfight. Cowboy Hill was shot numerous times when he tried to escape out of the back door of the apartment. Mistakenly reported killed, he survived but remained in custody for the rest of his life. 17 years later, the buckshot left over from this confrontation led to cancer and caused his death. On September 14th, Chapman was staying in the apartment but left early that morning to buy some cream for breakfast coffee. When he returned, the building was surrounded by police. He drove away and headed for Rochester, New York, and didn't stop except for gas. September 15, 1920, in New York, Chapman met with Dutch Anderson's lawyer William J. Baker and his law partner Grace Crampton early that morning. Chapman thought his association with the gang would be exposed and he would need a lawyer. He was wrong. His connection to the gang was not discovered until 1922. Baker and Crampton visited Chapman and Betty in Detroit a few days later, where they discussed Chapman's situation. Apparently at that time Chapman asked Baker to represent Hill and Forrest. Baker did represent Forrest in December 1920. Two teams in the gang confronted the police in October 1920. This led to the death of Albert Johnson and several arrests. So, by the end of the month, only Anderson, Chapman, and McGann were left in the leadership group. Nevertheless, 3 more robberies were committed by the gang in 1920. One of these robberies was in Ridgeville, Indiana, on December 3rd. By 1921, Chapman and Anderson were in jeopardy in Toledo. The gang was fundamentally destroyed by that time, with most of the leadership group either dead or in prison. Eddie Kelly was captured in Chicago in January 1921. He was sent to Winchester and was scheduled to go on trial for the Ridgeville robbery in April 1921. This trial date seems to have motivated Chapman and Anderson's move to New York. In early April of 1921, Dutch Anderson, Gerald Chapman, and Betty Bates went to New York City and moved into the Schuyler Arms apartment building on 98th Street near Riverside Drive. This began an odyssey of moving from one expensive residence to another every few weeks, while Chapman and Anderson supported their extravagant lifestyle through bootlegging and safecracking. Chapman and Betty posed as Mr. and Mrs. G. Vincent Colwell, and Anderson was William Lafarge. Supposedly Colwell was an oil man doing business in Kentucky, where he was buying and selling oil-rich properties for development. At this time, mail robbery of one form or another was common, and in early October, Chapman and Anderson set up their variation. Based on information given to them by postal employee Jeremiah Seville, they knew large amounts of cash and bonds were being routinely transported through the mail. Charles Lerber, another Auburn ex-convict, was added to the robbery team, and after several weeks of planning and rehearsal, the 3 men waylaid a mail truck on October 24, 1921. There was no clear determination of the value of what was stolen, but $2,400,000 is the most common number published. Some of this was cash, but most of it was in bonds, which would require further illegal activity to convert to cash. On December 1, 1921, Chapman, Anderson, and Lerber, with an unidentified 4th man, robbed an American Express office in Niagara Falls of 2 strong boxes containing approximately $40,000 in traveler's checks. This robbery set in motion an investigation that eventually solved both cases. For the next several months, Chapman, Betty, Anderson, and Lerber lived lavishly. They seemed to be safe, posing as rich and sophisticated pleasure seekers. In December of 1921, the American Express Company placed their prime investigator, Gordon McCarthy, on the case of the theft of the strongboxes. He spent weeks trying to trace the travelers' checks with little success. It wasn't until June of 1922 that McCarthy, posing as Jimmy McKnight, a thief from Toledo, met Chapman and Anderson through a federal undercover agent, Teddy Rose, an acquaintance of Charlie Lerber. Chapman, Anderson, and Lerber were arrested on July 3, 1922, by 2 New York police detectives and Gordon McCarthy, who had arranged to meet them concerning the sale of some of the stolen bonds from the mail robbery. A ploy to lure the men out in the open. At that time, Chapman, Anderson, and Betty were living in the exclusive Gramercy Park area of New York City. Betty was also arrested along with a friend from Arizona by the name of Catherine Moore. Both were questioned all night, but were not charged with any crime. In their trial in August 1922, Lerber testified against Chapman and Anderson, which resulted in a conviction for the federal crime of mail theft. Both men were sentenced to 25 years in prison in Atlanta, Georgia. In late August, Chapman and Anderson were sent to Atlanta, and soon after that they began planning to escape. Chapman escaped about 6 months later, but Anderson's escape did not take place until December 30, 1923. Chapman's escape was a 4-part drama in late March and early April of 1923. March 27th, Chapman, with another inmate, Frank Gray, escaped from the Atlanta penitentiary. March 28th, after a shootout with a sheriff's posse, Chapman and Gray were captured. Chapman was seriously wounded in the shootout and was sent to a hospital in nearby Athens, Georgia. He required surgery to remove a bullet from one of his kidneys. April 4th, Chapman, although weak and feverish, disappeared from his hospital room. An extensive search proved futile. April 6th, early in the morning, Chapman, still very weak, was found in the basement of the Athens hospital. Due to confusion caused by a frightened nurse and mistakes made by a guard, Chapman was able to escape again. Information about what happened when Gerald Chapman escaped from the hospital in Athens, Georgia, on April 4, 1923, is sketchy. Two New York gangsters, Dominic Didato and Abe Silverstein, attempted to aid Chapman, but missed connections when he escaped from his hospital room, forcing him to hide in the basement. Chapman said that after he walked away from the hospital on April 6th, he hid out in a field nearby. He said he broke into a garage, smeared his face with grease, and put on a pair of overalls to disguise himself. He said a girl gave him $10. Some people in Athens, Georgia saw a man limping around in a park. A woman in Athens said a stranger stopped at her house and asked for water. On April 6, 1923, Charlie Wolf, often credited with rescuing Chapman, was about a month into a 6-month sentence at the Indiana prison farm in Putnamville. On April 6, 1923, Dr. Harry Spickerman, identified as rescuing Chapman in one theory, was participating in a trap shooting contest in Muncie, Indiana. On April 6, 1923, George Red McGann was on the steamship Eagle in the Atlantic Ocean, 4 days from docking in Baltimore. Chapman had help from somewhere, and circumstantial evidence points to McGann. A private detective looking for Red McGann in 1923 stated that someone spent the spring and summer of that year in a hospital in Kenton, Ohio, then abandoned a trunk full of clothes belonging to McGann when they left. Chapman was about the same size as McGann and could have used this clothing. Police in Lima, Ohio, about 30 miles west of Kenton, were convinced that Chapman had been in Lima during 1923 and had participated in several robberies attributed to Red McGann. On December 18, 1923, Red McGann was arrested in Marietta, Ohio. Stolen goods in his car connected him to several robberies committed that year, including the Wright Metzler robbery. Dutch Anderson escaped from the Atlanta prison on December 30, 1923. Chapman's involvement in this escape is unproven, but the police in Connecticut found evidence to show that he and Anderson were in Lima, Ohio, in January of 1924. By the beginning of April in 1924, Red McGann was about to go on trial in Dayton, Ohio. At the time of this trial, federal agents were in attendance hoping that some evidence of Chapman's whereabouts would be revealed. These agents believed that Chapman had spent several months in 1923 assisting McGann. On April 5 and 6, 1924, saleswoman Catherine Bourne saw and spoke to Chapman as he examined a Lincoln in the Stanton showroom. Chapman, Anderson, and John Brennan stole the Lincoln Phaeton in Steubenville, Ohio late at night April 6 or early morning April 7, then headed west. April 7, 1924. The car stalled on the road between Steubenville and Canton. A bus driver, William Allison, stopped and asked Chapman if he needed help. Chapman dismissed the bus driver rudely, and soon after that they moved on. James J. Doran, a New York postal inspector who took part in the investigation of the 1921 mail truck robbery, acting on a tip that Chapman was in Toledo, sent agents there to search for him. In Angola, Indiana, Chapman stole a Ford owned by a man named Waldo Miller. According to Ben Hance, Chapman showed up at his farm in Eaton, Indiana, near Muncie, in early April 1924, calling himself Waldo Tom Miller. Tom Miller said a doctor prescribed a long rest for him in the country. In February 1924, the Department of Internal Revenue Narcotics Division had agents in Muncie investigating Dr. Harry Spickerman for the illegal sale of morphine. Spickerman was also accused of organizing and operating a large-scale drug distribution network that stretched from Canada through Chicago and throughout the Midwest. This included using addicts as salesmen and distributors. Spickerman admitted his involvement in this network went back to 1920. On April 1, 1924, Spickerman was arrested in Indianapolis. He was released on a $5,000 bond on his own recognizance. About a week after Spickerman was arrested, Chapman showed up at Ben Hance's farmhouse looking for a place to stay. Chapman was apparently offered a hideout in Muncie by Spickerman and expected to stay in his house. It was big, and had rooms to rent. He had been there before. One room even had a private entrance and a private telephone. However, 3 men showing up at 122 North Mulberry would have been inconvenient for Spickerman. It was just 1 week after his arrest, and he could be jailed at any time, especially if he was caught harboring 3 fugitives. He also had a family complication. His sister-in-law, Velma Ogle Davis, and her 7-month-old son were living there. So he sent Chapman to Ben Hance. At the time, the Hance farm seemed to be a perfect hideout, an obscure place near a small town in east-central Indiana. Shortly after his first meeting with Hance, Chapman and his 2 companions, Anderson and Brennan, rented rooms in Hance's farmhouse. Brennan stayed only a short time, but Chapman and Anderson continued as roomers from April until sometime in August of 1924. Ben testified in Chapman's trial of 1925 that Spickerman met with them several times during the spring and summer of 1924. During the April to August timeline, there were 2 robberies attributed to Chapman and Anderson, one in May in Middletown, Ohio, and one in New York City in June. The logic connecting Chapman to the Middletown robbery is at best shaky. During the summer of 1924, Fred Puckett and Postal Inspector Kelly had a hat and a description of a car both originating from the robbery in Middletown, Ohio. The only solid piece of information was that the hat came from the Keller store in Muncie. Supposedly, this hat was stolen by a man who was later identified as Chapman. The car was described as a touring car with 7 men in it, blue with a yellow stripe. Chapman's stolen 4-passenger Lincoln Phaeton might have been blue, but it had no yellow stripe. No information about this robbery originating in Ohio indicates that Chapman was a suspect at the time of the robbery. Ohio officials only considered Chapman a suspect after he was captured. So, in 1925, one of the 2 Middletown couriers who was robbed was shown pictures of Chapman and failed to positively identify him as a participant in the robbery. Nevertheless, news articles imply that the hat and the description of the car led Puckett and Kelly to Ben Hance, who in turn helped them find Chapman. Between late June and early October 1924, Chapman made a series of trips to Massachusetts from Indiana and back again. Late June 1924, Springfield, Massachusetts. Gerald Chapman and Walter Sheen met for the first time. Later meetings included Dutch Anderson. Walter Sheen was a businessman and rich man's son who was in and out of trouble with the law for several years before he met Chapman. It is commonly believed that Chapman and Anderson considered Sheen a dupe, to be used and extorted. Sheen believed they wanted him to be a business partner, either in liquor sales or counterfeiting. August 30, 1924. At the end of August, Chapman raided the Sheehan department store in Elmira, New York, stealing many items of expensive clothing. September 4th, fur coats from that robbery were sent to Dr. Spickerman. September 15th, Chapman and Anderson made a down payment of $5,000 on a house in Massachusetts intended as their future headquarters. September 20th, Chapman left Anderson in Massachusetts and returned to Muncie. In Eaton and Hartford City in the 1920s, there was a gang of car thieves that probably assisted Chapman. Spickerman was somehow associated with this gang. On September 23, 1924, he testified in court in Huntington, Indiana, that a car thief, Fred Foreman, was sick and in bed on the day of his alleged theft. Foreman was found guilty. The Bayless Art Store on East Main Street was broken into on September 30, 1924. 9 rugs described as Oriental and valued at $1,400 were stolen. Chapman was implicated in the robbery, and one of the rugs was introduced as evidence at his trial. Late September, the Hub Department Store, Muncie, Indiana. The fur coats from the Sheehan robbery were taken to the Hub Department Store for resale. In December 1924, several people, including Charlie Wolfe, were arrested for handling stolen goods for resale in this store. In this situation, the furs were considered too expensive and inappropriate for resale in a discount store. So, they were sent back to Walter Sheen in Springfield, Massachusetts. October 5, 1924. Very early on the morning of October 5th, Chapman blew the safe in Stillman's and escaped with about $2,500. He left Muncie soon after that robbery. October 9th, Chapman arrived in Springfield, Massachusetts. October 11th, Chapman and Walter Sheen went to New Britain, Connecticut. Chapman examined the Davidson and Leventhal department store, while Sheen waited in the Lincoln Phaeton. October 12th, Chapman and Sheen attempted to rob this store. Sheen was arrested and the Lincoln was confiscated, but Chapman escaped by shooting his way out of the store, fatally wounding police officer James Skelly. October 14th, Edward Hickey, Connecticut detective, searched Walter Sheen's storeroom in Springfield, Massachusetts. There he found a leather bag containing stolen furs from the She & Dean department store. Under the shipping label on this bag, Hickey found a second label which revealed the address of Dr. Harry Spickerman in Muncie, Indiana. Also found was a burlap bag marked Eaton, Indiana, and some boxes labeled Lambert Brothers, Eaton, Indiana. Edward Hickey called the Muncie police and talked to Fred Puckett. On Sunday evening, October 12, 1924, Gerald Chapman was in the Cooley Hotel in Springfield, Massachusetts, and left a note for Walter Sheen. The next day he learned he was wanted for murder, and he took a train to White River Junction, Vermont. He stayed there for 3 days before moving on. On October 14, 1924, Fred Puckett, captain of detectives for the Muncie Police Department, received information from Edward Hickey that Dr. Harry Spickerman and Gerald Chapman were apparently collaborators, and Chapman had sent stolen goods to Spickerman. Hickey requested that Spickerman be watched. In addition to the revelation about the association of Chapman and Spickerman, Hickey told Puckett about Chapman's possible link to Eaton and provided him with an exact description of the stolen Lincoln Phaeton. With this information, Puckett was able to discover that Chapman had been staying at the home of Ben Hance near Eaton. The date of this discovery is unknown because on October 15th, Puckett started his 2-week vacation. He drove to Kentucky, as was confirmed by a news article published on October 18th. The status of the search for Gerald Chapman was apparently in limbo for at least 2 weeks. Based on Puckett's apparent attitude at the information he had just been given, it can be assumed that Edward Hickey was not taken seriously. On October 15th, the Muncie Evening Press published a picture of Dutch Anderson, erroneously identified as Gerald Chapman. On November 7th, Hickey wrote a letter to Chief of Police Earl Randolph. Included with this letter were several copies of a circular that had been sent out to hotels all over the country, including Muncie. The circular had a picture and description of Chapman and was sent out immediately after the murder of Skelly. This picture could have been published in the paper correcting the error of mid-October, but it wasn't published until January 1925. In this letter of November 7th, Hickey cautiously suggests that Randolph watch Spickerman. Hickey's cautious attitude seems to suggest that he has no confidence that the Muncie police were investigating Spickerman. Despite the apparent lack of interest in Hickey's information, there was an attempt to capture Chapman in the November to January period. Unnamed policemen visited an undisclosed location and found guns, burglars' tools, and evidence to link Chapman to the Stillman's robbery of October 5th. This seems to have set in motion an attempt to cover up Dr. Spickerman's association with Chapman. Behind this was his brother-in-law Van Ogle, the Delaware County prosecuting attorney. The Muncie police may have been trying to bury Spickerman's connection to Chapman at the direction of Van Ogle. Ogle had protected Spickerman in the past and was later accused of collaborating with Chapman, which he denied. It's likely that Ogle had no idea Spickerman was collaborating with Chapman until he was shown the evidence in late 1924. Then he did all he could to keep his sister, Faye, from being prosecuted or exposed to the possibility of reprisal. This may have meant running interference between Puckett and Spickerman, using his position as prosecutor to squelch potential criminal charges. Spickerman wasn't charged for aiding Chapman, although he can clearly be linked to Chapman as a collaborator. Neither Dr. Spickerman nor his wife was called as a witness in Chapman's trial, although each probably had as much contact with Chapman as Ben Hance did. This cover-up was apparently not approved of by Van's brother. In June 1925, Guy Ogle resigned as deputy prosecuting attorney. When asked why he resigned, he only said that his reasons were of a private nature. Chapman left Vermont about the time Puckett went on vacation, and on October 28th, he robbed the George E. Smith & Sons jewelry store in Parkersburg, West Virginia. When Chapman was arrested in Muncie, he had a watch that was on the list of stolen items the owner sent to Edward Hickey. During December 1924, several stolen cars accumulated in Muncie. One of these was an Oakland that had been stolen from the Hedin Motor Sales Company in Bucyrus, Ohio, on November 5, 1924. This car was linked to Chapman at the time of his arrest, but whether he was directly involved in the theft has never been confirmed. It is likely that when Chapman returned to Indiana, he went to Fort Wayne. There is circumstantial evidence to show that he and Anderson were living in or near that city during the last 2 months of 1924. The exact nature of the Spickerman and Chapman collaboration remains a mystery. Since Spickerman was under indictment for the illegal sale and distribution of drugs, and Chapman first appeared near the time of Spickerman's arrest, there might have been a connection. At the time of his trial in late May 1925, the agents led by Leslie J. Ulmer believed that Spickerman had received numerous shipments of drugs from Chapman. The implication was that Chapman had smuggled in drugs from Canada, as well as whiskey. Spickerman and Chapman could have been collaborating in a drug smuggling operation as early as 1920. At the beginning of 1924, 3 separate branches of the federal government may have been hunting Gerald Chapman and Dutch Anderson. In addition to Ulmer's agents, there were 2 other groups. The post office, represented locally by Inspector Ace Kelly, wanted them captured and sent back to prison. William J. Burns, director of the Bureau of Investigations, wanted to know who financed Chapman and Anderson when they escaped from the Atlanta prison. He suspected New York gangsters were responsible for escape attempts, bribery, and drug use in federal prisons, including Atlanta. By April 1, 1924, Harry Spickerman was an increasingly desperate man. Van Ogle had limitations and could not help in his federal drug case, so Harry had to come up with something on his own. Maybe he thought he could bring Chapman to Muncie, hide him in Eaton, and question him about his connections in New York relative to drug smuggling and corruption in federal prisons. He hoped to trade information for a lighter sentence. By October 14, 1924, it was clear that Harry's plan had failed. Chapman and Anderson's link to New York gangsters was never discovered. They left Eaton to commit several crimes. Then Chapman killed Officer James Skelly, and Edward Hickey contacted Fred Puckett. Puckett, possibly through Van Ogle, got the message to Spickerman not to warn Chapman. Why was Harry Spickerman involved in crime? The answer may have been simple. He needed the money, and he was addicted to drugs. At the end of 1924, Spickerman was trapped in circumstances he had created. He could only hope that Chapman would not come back. All Spickerman could do was to sit tight, stay silent, and hope for the best. There is a report that Chapman met with an unidentified elderly woman on either the 14th or 15th of December. At this meeting, he rented her garage, which was in the 1400 block of East Gilbert Street. This garage was used by Chapman to hide stolen cars. The name of this woman was never revealed, but the information given seems to point to Emmeline Updegraft, who had a boarding house at 1417 East Gilbert Street and a garage located on the alley between Washington and Gilbert. Supposedly, Spickerman's place was being watched from October to the date of Chapman's capture from a room in the Bronx facing Washington Street. Chapman committed 2 robberies in December, within a few blocks of Spickerman's house. He stole a watch and some clothing from Banta and a Chrysler from the Walnut Motor Car Company. This, and the apparent lack of desire on the part of the Muncie police to link Chapman to Spickerman, seems to indicate that surveillance on Spickerman's house was intermittent and cursory. There were ways into the south side of that house that couldn't be observed from the Braun Hotel. January 16, 1925, the 4 Mile House, east of Fort Wayne. Fred Puckett never stopped following the trail of Chapman north of Muncie. After October 14th, he apparently took pictures of Chapman and Anderson and kept asking if anyone had seen either of the 2 men. Eventually, he found out that they spent every Friday evening at the 4 Mile House, a speakeasy near Fort Wayne. A few days before Chapman's capture, he and another policeman visited the 4 Mile House where he encountered Anderson. He could have arrested Anderson but didn't because he felt that his arrest would be a warning to Chapman and he would disappear again. January 17, 1925. As the story goes, the police were tipped off that Chapman was seen entering a house in a residential district. Early the next morning, Captain Puckett set up 2 policemen to watch the house at 122 North Mulberry Street. January 18, 1925. This is the intersection of Mulberry and Washington Streets, as it looked from the smokestack at the power plant. Chapman was in Spickerman's house until about 11:30 a.m. Officer Mervyn Collins was watching the house from the main lobby of the Braun House Hotel. He would have been looking through this window. Officer Samuel Goodpaster was watching from a vantage point on the west side of Mulberry Street. He left the scene to join Captain Puckett and Officer Harry Brown in a car. Did they know where to go? Could they see Collins and follow his direction? Did they follow behind Collins? What were Chapman's plans for that Sunday? There are several theories about what Chapman was planning for that day. One theory was that he was going to break into a rich man's house, then rob a bank. Gerald Chapman, lighting his pipe, stepped out of Dr. Spickerman's door, onto the sidewalk, and headed south. He seemed to be completely unaware that his hideout had been compromised. Muncie policeman Mervyn Collins, watching him from across Washington Street, would have come out of the Braun lobby as Chapman headed toward Main Street. Chapman crossed Main Street and walked another block south toward Jackson Street. To his left was the Delaware Hotel. To his right was the Weiser Grand Theater. Was he going to meet someone perhaps at a hotel along the way? Dutch Anderson? Turk Brennan? Betty Bates, another of the many rumors about that day. He turned east, walking past the hotel, the Bell Telephone Building, and the Canopic Apartments at Jefferson Street. Rumors say that he spent time playing pool at the St. John Hotel, just east of the library. Instead of going there, he turned south again on Jefferson Street. Just a block ahead was the YMCA. He crossed Adams Street. He walked another block south to Charles Street. Just west of the intersection was an escape route, the traction station. A wanted fugitive who was aware that he was being followed might seek a place where he could get lost. Maybe the traction station wasn't crowded on a Sunday morning. Maybe the trains weren't running that day. Instead, he turned east again. In January of 1925, the home of banker W. E. Hitchcock may have been vacant. The 1925 city directory shows the family living at 710 Riverside. At a point between W. E. Hitchcock's house and Dr. Spurgeon's house, Chapman was interrupted by Puckett, Brown, and Goodpaster in the car. This is Puckett's description of what happened as published in 1926. I stopped the car in the middle of the street, and I says to Chapman, "Mister, are you acquainted here?" He says, "Somewhat." He was walking then with the bottom button of his coat buttoned, and he had his right hand under his coat on the left-hand side. I knew his hand was on his gun. "Where does Dr. Spurgeon live?" I says to him, "I have got an awful sick man in this car, and I want to see the doctor." Well, he commenced backing away. By that time, I was out of the car, and Officer Brown was coming out off the car on the other side. I attracted his attention and was walking right to him, and he backing away. I says, "I think that he lives in this next house," and kept going at him. "You know," I says, "I can't see very good. What's that number up there, a 3 or an 8? Right then, I was figuring if he pulled the gun up from his belt, it would give me a chance to fall. If he pulled it out, I thought maybe I could get in quicker anyway. So, he pulls the gun, and just as I was about to spring at him, falling to the right, he fires. The bullet went right by me here between my arm and left side. And I springs at him, and by that time Officer Brown had hit him, and we all went down to the ground together. So, in the tussle there, we got him fastened. Fred Puckett wanted him alive. They took him alive. One shot was fired. It missed. Chapman spent just a few more hours in Muncie before he was taken to Indianapolis. During that time, he said very little and would not answer questions about the accusations made against him. He was polite on the surface, but beneath that facade he was belligerent and angry. He was angry at the man who had turned him in for blood money, as he characterized it. He never identified this man, but it has always been assumed that he was referring to Ben Hance. On January 21st, he was taken to Union Station and sent back to Atlanta prison. Chapman may have been somewhat optimistic about this transfer. He escaped from that prison in 1923, and he could do it again. Hugh Alcorn, representing the state of Connecticut, had other ideas, and by February of 1925, Chapman had been extradited to Hartford, Connecticut, and held in Wethersfield Prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. According to reports published shortly after Chapman's capture, Muncie was visited by federal agents in March 1924. The story states they were looking for bonds from the Leonard Street robbery of 1921 because some of the bonds had shown up in Delaware County. The large stash of bonds thought to have been in Muncie, however, were never found. Supposedly, Muncie had been identified as Chapman's headquarters. So, this visit was characterized as the beginning of a full-scale manhunt targeting Gerald Chapman. This was an exaggeration, but it fit into a narrative that local law enforcement wanted to project in 1925. Instead of cooperation between the Muncie police and the Connecticut detective Edward Hickey, there was competition which created friction. In February of 1925, Hickey made statements to the press relating how he was responsible for the capture of Chapman. Fred Puckett, Ace Kelly, and Chief of Police Earl Randolph forcefully denied this. Puckett and Kelly said they had never heard of Edward Hickey, even though Hickey had provided the information that linked Dr. Spickerman to Gerald Chapman. Earl Randolph was dismissive of the claims made by Connecticut detectives. In 1925, shortly after Chapman's trial began, Randolph said, information leading to Chapman's discovery was derived from a local case. He claimed that information from outside sources came late in the process, shortly before the actual arrest, as it is phrased in the article. The trial in Hartford started on March 24th and lasted until April 4th, at which time Chapman was found guilty. Then the legal maneuvering to try and save Chapman's life began. This would last for one turbulent year. On August 14, 1925, Ben and Mary Hance were shot and killed by Dutch Anderson on the road to Middletown in southwest Delaware County. Charlie Wolf, aka One-Arm Wolf, was also implicated in the murders. Chapman and Anderson believed that Hance had provided the information to Puckett that led to Chapman's capture. Apparently, they believed that Hance, seeking a reward, started talking to the police in the summer of 1924. Puckett didn't connect Ben Hance with Chapman and Anderson until late October or early November 1924. By that time, Puckett, through Edward Hickey, had identified Spickerman as Chapman's collaborator and didn't need Hance's information. Since Hance was a witness at Chapman's trial, not Spickerman, Hance was targeted for retribution. After a year of appeals and legal maneuvering, George Chartreuse, alias Gerald Chapman, was executed on April 6, 1926, 3 years after he walked away from the hospital in Athens, Georgia. In May of 1926, Fred Puckett went to Connecticut to claim the $3,500 reward for the capture of Chapman. At the court hearing concerning the reward, Puckett and Hickey were cordial to one another, with Puckett's acknowledgement that the key information resulting in the capture of Chapman was the express tag. Hickey and State Attorney Hugh Alcorn complimented Puckett by calling him the only honest man in Muncie. Alcorn also made the curious statement that Puckett played a lone hand in tracking down Chapman. In a later interview conducted in Connecticut, Puckett made the statement, "Politics is rotten out there." These are the words of a frustrated man. Spickerman should have been arrested and forced to testify. Even though 2 of the 4 members of the Ogle family were law enforcement officials, they should have testified as witnesses. Spickerman's wife, Fay Ogle, and sister Velma were also probable witnesses to the association of Chapman and Spickerman. There were many questions this group could have answered. Who tipped the police as to Chapman's location on January 17th? Why did Chapman feel safe leaving Spickerman's house the morning he was captured? How long had Spickerman been collaborating with Chapman? What was the extent of Spickerman's involvement in Chapman's illegal activities? Was he dealing drugs, fencing stolen goods, or dealing in stolen bonds? Was there bribery of public officials, policemen, judges, even the mayor? All of this was done in Toledo in 1919 and 1920. Why not in Muncie in 1924? Most importantly, was Van Ogle being bribed? On the surface, this appears unrealistic. Chapman was a fugitive on the run the entire year of 1924, and his Toledo gang was non-existent. By January 18, 1925, all his resources were in a bag in Dr. Spickerman's house. This bag contained about $4,500 in cash, $3,000 in Liberty bonds, some pieces of jewelry, and 2 bottles of nitroglycerin. If there were bribes, where was the money coming from? Another question, another contradiction, another mystery to solve. The historian's persistent dilemma.